These young offenders have committed shocking and violent crimes that even hardened inmates fear. From gang violence to deadly attacks, these children have left a trail of terror behind them. How did they become so dangerous at such a young age? Join us as we explore the shocking crimes and the chilling lives of these teen criminals that have earned them a notorious reputation in America's toughest prisons. The first on our list is Lionel Alexander Tate. Lionel Tate became one of the most infamous juvenile offenders in U.S. history. His crime shocked the nation due to the brutal nature of the act and the age of both the victim and the perpetrator. Tate was only 12 years old when he was convicted of the murder of 6-year-old Tiffany Unick in 1999. The case raised significant questions about the criminal justice system's treatment of children, the nature of violent behavior in young people, and the psychological profile of juvenile offenders.
Defense attorney in this case wants to put on trial television and professional wrestling rather than the fact that this 12-year-old is indicted for first-degree murder and he should be tried for that murder.
It was a sham. All this talk about professional wrestling all became just one big bowl of nonsense.
On July 28, 1999, Lionel Tate was left alone with Tiffany Unick at his mother's apartment in Broward County, Florida. Tiffany was a young girl who was visiting Lionel, a friend of the family, for the day. At some point during their time together, Tate, who was much larger and stronger than Tiffany, allegedly began wrestling with her. According to Tate, he had been attempting to mimic professional wrestling moves he had seen on television. Tragically, the wrestling turned violent, and Tiffany was killed in the process. He later claimed that he didn't know his actions could result in death, but the extent of Tiffany's injury suggested that he had acted with an extreme amount of force. Tiffany's body showed signs of severe blunt force trauma, including a fractured skull, broken ribs, and internal bleeding. Initially, Tate's mother was unaware of the true nature of Tiffany's injuries. Lionel first claimed that Tiffany had fallen accidentally and had simply died as a result of the fall. However, an autopsy quickly revealed that the injuries were consistent with a violent assault. The details of the case, along with Lionel's changing stories, led authorities to charge him with first-degree murder. Lionel Tate's trial garnered national attention because of his age. At 12 years old, he was one of the youngest people ever charged with first-degree murder in the United States. His defense argued that Lionel did not fully understand the consequences of his actions, citing his age and developmental level. Tate's legal team intended that he had mimicked the violent acts he saw on wrestling programs and was unaware of their potential to cause harm. The prosecution, on the other hand, argued that Lionel's actions were intentional, especially given the severity of Tiffany's injuries. They believed that Lionel had acted with malice, despite his age, and that his knowledge of wrestling moves indicated a certain level of understanding and intent. The jury ultimately found Lionel Tate guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This verdict was met with shock and controversy, as many believed that sentencing such a young child to life in prison without a chance for release was both cruel and unjust. Many juvenile justice advocates argued that Lionel should have been treated as a child, not an adult, and that the court failed to properly account for his age and psychological development. After the conviction, in 2004, Lionel Tate's conviction was overturned on appeal. His defense argued that he had been denied a fair trial and that his attorneys had failed to properly represent him during the proceedings. The appeals court ruled that Tate's original defense attorney had been ineffective and that Lionel's guilty plea had been coerced. In 2004, Tate was retried in a separate case in which he was convicted of a second-degree murder in the case of a violent robbery, this time resulting in a different legal outcome. Tate was ultimately sentenced to 30 years in prison, yet there were still ongoing questions about his treatment in prison. Lionel Tate's case remains one of the most controversial juvenile crime stories in the U.S. It raised important questions about how the justice system should treat young offenders and whether children have the capacity to truly understand the consequences of their actions. In the years following his conviction and eventual release, Lionel Tate has sought to reintegrate into society. However, the psychological scars from the experience, both for Tate and for those affected by Tiffany's death, continue to linger. His story highlights the complexities of juvenile justice, particularly when it involves children who commit horrific acts but may not fully understand the implications of their actions. Next on our list is a female that will leave you shocked. Alyssa Bustamante. Alyssa Bustamante was a 15-year-old girl from St. Martin's, Missouri, who gained national infamy in 2009 after brutally murdering her 9-year-old neighbor Elizabeth Olton. The case shocked the nation due to Alyssa's age, the apparent lack of motive, and the chilling details that emerge from her diary and psychological profile.
I guess just tell me a little bit about yourself so I understand where all this is coming from.
I really like nature.
Alyssa Bustamante was born on January 28, 1994, into a troubled home. Her parents had a history of substance abuse, leading to her and her younger siblings being raised by their grandparents. Despite this, Alyssa was an intelligent student and was seen as relatively well-adjusted. However, underneath the surface, she struggled with depression, self-harm, and dark thoughts. She had a history of cutting herself and had even attempted suicide at a young age. On October 21, 2009, Alyssa lured Elizabeth Olton, a neighborhood girl who was friends with her younger sister, into the woods under the pretense of playing. Once they were alone, Alyssa attacked Elizabeth, strangling her, slitting her throat, and stabbing her in the chest. She then buried the body in a shallow grave she had dug beforehand. After the murder, Alyssa returned home as if nothing had happened. Later, investigators discovered her journal where she had coldly documented the killing, describing the experience as amazing and stating that it gave her a thrill. Her journal entry read in part, "I just fucking killed someone. I strangled them and slit their throat and stabbed them. It was amazing. As soon as you get over the oh my god, I can't do this feeling, it's pretty enjoyable." Elizabeth's disappearance triggered a massive search effort, with police and volunteers combing the area. After questioning Alyssa, police found inconsistencies in her statements and eventually discovered the grave she had dug. When confronted, she confessed to the crime. Authorities later determined that Alyssa had planned the murder simply to see what it felt like to kill someone. Her premeditation was evidenced by the fact that she had dug multiple graves days before, indicating that she had been considering killing someone for some time. Initially, Alyssa was charged with first-degree murder and faced life without parole. However, she accepted a plea deal, pleading guilty to second-degree murder and armed criminal action. In 2012, she was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole, plus 30 years for the weapons charge. During the sentencing hearing, Elizabeth Olton's mother gave an emotional victim impact statement describing the devastating loss of her daughter. Alyssa, in turn, apologized, but many found her remorse unconvincing given the disturbing nature of her crime. In the years since her imprisonment, Alyssa Bustamante has largely remained out of the public eye. However, her case continues to be cited in discussions about juvenile crime, the psychology of young offenders, and the justice system's handling of teenage murderers. Jordan Brown. Jordan Brown was just 11 years old when he was accused of committing one of the most shocking crimes in U.S. history, the murder of his father's pregnant fiancée, 26-year-old Kenzie Houck, in February 2009. The case became infamous due to Jordan's age, the legal battle that followed, and the controversial nature of his conviction. Jordan Brown was born on August 12, 1997, and lived in Wampum, Pennsylvania, with his father, Christopher Brown, and Christopher's fiancée, Kenzie Houck. Kenzie was 8.5 months pregnant at the time of her murder and already had 2 young daughters from a previous relationship. By most accounts, Jordan was a normal, well-behaved kid who enjoyed playing sports and hunting with his father. However, prosecutors would later argue that Jordan harbored resentment toward Kenzie and her unborn child, feeling that she was replacing him in his father's life. On the morning of February 20, 2009, Kenzie Houck was found shot in the back of the head while sleeping in bed at her home. The bullet killed both her and her unborn child instantly. Police determined that the murder weapon was a youth-sized 20-gauge shotgun, which belonged to Jordan. Investigators theorized that Jordan retrieved his shotgun, shot Kenzie execution style, covered up the evidence, and went to school as if nothing had happened. The key witness in the case was Kenzie's 7-year-old daughter, Adeline, who told police she saw Jordan carrying a shotgun that morning. Police also found a spent shotgun shell on the ground outside the house. Within a few hours, Jordan Brown was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder as an adult, a controversial decision, as Pennsylvania law at the time required juveniles accused of homicide to be charged as adults by default. Jordan spent the next 3 years in a juvenile detention center, awaiting trial. His defense team maintained his innocence, arguing that there was no physical evidence tying him to the murder. They also pointed out inconsistencies in the testimony of Kenzie's daughter. In 2012, after much legal debate, Jordan's case was moved to juvenile court. He was convicted of first-degree murder in 2012 in juvenile court, meaning he would be held in a juvenile detention center until age 21. Jordan's legal team appealed the conviction, arguing that there was insufficient evidence to prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. In 2018, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court overturned his conviction, ruling that the prosecution's case was based on circumstantial evidence and that the court had failed to prove Jordan committed the crime. After spending nearly 9 years in detention, Jordan Brown's name was clear. He was released and declared innocent. Since his release, Jordan Brown has remained out of the public eye. His case remains one of the most controversial in modern U.S. legal history, sparking debates about juvenile justice and whether children should be tried as adults, wrongful convictions, and the limits of circumstantial evidence. How young is too young to commit premeditated murder? Despite his exoneration, many people still debate whether Jordan Brown was truly innocent or if he got away with murder. His case stands as a reminder of how the legal system can be flawed when dealing with child defendants. Catherine and Curtis Jones. On a quiet night in January 1999, in a small home in Brevard County, Florida, 2 children made a decision that would shock the nation. Catherine and Curtis Jones were just 12 and 13 years old, became the youngest children in the United States to be charged as adults for murder. Their crime was horrific, but the story behind it was even more disturbing. It wasn't a case of mindless violence or teenage rebellion. It was an act of desperation fueled by years of suffering. Catherine and Curtis didn't grow up in a loving or safe home. Instead, they endured years of sexual and physical abuse from men who were close to their father. According to later court documents and interviews, these men repeatedly assaulted Catherine, while Curtis forced to take matters into their own hands because the people responsible for protecting them did nothing. They wanted to escape, to be saved. They reached out to adults, and reports were even filed with the Florida Department of Children and Families. But no one acted, no one stepped in. Their cries for help were ignored, leaving them trapped in a nightmare with no one to turn to, with nowhere to go and no protection from the horrors inside their home. The siblings made a fateful decision. If no one would save them, they would save themselves. Just a child himself could do nothing but witness his sister's pain. The worst part was siblings claimed their father, Curtis Jones Sr., knew about the abuse, but did nothing to stop it. Catherine and Curtis tried to tell people what was happening. In their young minds, this was the only way to escape the horror they lived in every day. They retrieved a .38 caliber revolver from their father's home, knowing exactly what they needed to do. Their emotions of fear, anger, and desperation must have been overwhelming. One evening, as their father and his friends carried on as usual, Catherine and Curtis quietly made their move. The plan wasn't to kill just anyone. They intended to murder their father and another man they believed was sexually abusing Catherine. But then, for reasons that remain unclear, their plan changed. Instead of targeting their father or the alleged abuser, they turned their attention to a different person, Sonia Nicole Spates, their father's 29-year-old girlfriend. It was January 6, 1999. Sonia was inside the home, unaware that 2 children were about to end her life. At some point in the evening, Curtis crept up behind her while she was sitting in the living room. In his small hands, he held the gun they had stolen. He raised it, aimed and fired. The bullet struck Sonia in the chest, sending her crashing to the ground. She didn't survive. The siblings didn't wait to see what happened next. They panicked and ran, disappearing into the thick woods surrounding their home. They had no plan beyond that moment, just an overwhelming need to flee from the horror they had created. But their escape didn't last long. By the next day, authorities had found them. What happened next shocked the country. Instead of recognizing that these were children pushed to the edge by years of trauma, the state of Florida charged them as adults for first-degree murder. 2 frightened, exhausted children alone in the woods were taken into custody. They were no longer just victims of abuse. Now, they were murderers in the eyes of the law. They were not given the option of being tried in juvenile court. Instead, the justice system decided they deserved to be punished to the fullest extent of the law, despite their young age and the circumstances that led to the crime. The prospect of life in prison loomed over them. To avoid that fate, both Catherine and Curtis pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for reduced sentences. They were sentenced to 18 years in prison. The prison did not break them. Over the years, both Catherine and Curtis focused on education, personal growth, and preparing for life after release. Finally, in 2015, after 16 years behind bars, they were granted parole and set free. Curtis was released first in July 2015. Now a grown man, he worked to rebuild his life after spending more than half of it in prison. Catherine followed shortly after, in August 2015. But instead of disappearing from the public eye, she chose to speak out about her past. She became an advocate for victims of child abuse, using her story to raise awareness about how failing to protect children can lead to tragic consequences. In interviews, she expressed remorse for the murder but also emphasized how the system had failed her and her brother. Their case remains one of the most controversial in American history. Some believe they were cold-blooded killers who deserved their punishment. Others argue they were children pushed to their breaking point. T.J. Lane. On February 27, 2012, a quiet morning at Chardon High School in Ohio turned into a scene of horror when T.J. Lane, a 17-year-old student, opened fire in the school cafeteria. Within seconds, he shot 6 students, killing 3 and injuring 3 others. Unlike many school shooters, Lane had no clear motive. He wasn't bullied. He wasn't targeting anyone specific, and he had no history of violent behavior at school. Yet, his actions that day were nothing short of monstrous. It was a typical Monday morning, and students were gathered in the cafeteria before class. Without warning, T.J. Lane walked in, pulled out a .22 caliber handgun, and began shooting. His first victim was 16-year-old Daniel Parmenter, who was sitting at a table with friends. Lane shot him in the back of the head. Next, he turned to 17-year-old Russell King Jr. and 16-year-old Demetrius Hewlin, shooting both of them at close range. As panic erupted, students ran for cover. Lane fired at 3 more students, hitting Nick Volchak, who was paralyzed from the waist down and injuring 2 others before leaving the building. A teacher chased Lane out of the school, and he was captured minutes later in the woods nearby, still armed. By the end of the day, 3 students were dead, and a small Ohio town was left in shock. Who was T.J. Lane? Before the shooting, T.J. Lane wasn't considered a troubled teen. He had no major disciplinary issues at school and wasn't involved in gangs or violent behavior, but his home life was far from normal. Lane came from a broken family. His father, Thomas Lane, had a long history of domestic violence, drug abuse, and run-ins with the law. He lived with his grandparents and was described as quiet, introverted, and artistic, but also dark and withdrawn. He had a history of depression and claimed he heard voices. Despite these factors, no one saw the massacre coming. After his arrest, Lane initially seemed emotionless. But as the trial progressed, his true nature began to emerge. In court, he smirked, laughed, and taunted the victims' families. He wore a white t-shirt with the word killer written in marker across the chest. During sentencing, he flipped off the families of the victims and said, "This hand that pulled the trigger that killed your sons now masturbates to the memory. Fuck all of you." His complete lack of remorse stunned the courtroom. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In 2014, 2 years after his conviction, Lane escaped from the Allen Knollwood Correctional Institution with 2 other inmates. They climbed over a 13-foot fence and ran into the woods, triggering a massive manhunt. Lane was captured just a few hours later, still wearing his prison uniform. The escape only reinforced the belief that Lane was a calculated, remorseless individual who thrived on chaos and attention. After his escape attempt, Lane was moved to a maximum security prison in Youngstown, Ohio, where he remains to this day. He is serving 3 life sentences for his crimes. To this day, Lane has never expressed remorse for the murders. His actions shows he enjoys to kill. These cases are reminders that beneath the surface of what seems like innocence, darkness can sometimes take root. But they also highlight failures of the system, of families, and of society to intervene before it's too late. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe these kids were born to kill, or were they victims of their environment? And should children be tried as adults for crimes like these? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next true crime update.